Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I would like to welcome you to Barry Brown's talk, The Magical Emotion of Location's Family Values. I was trying to remember when I met Barry, and I couldn't. I've just known him, I guess, so long, but maybe he knows. But we're thrilled to have him. He's a brand new professor down in the communications department at UCSD, so University of California, San Diego. So hopefully we'll be seeing more of him than when he was over at the University of Glasgow. So thanks for being here, Barry.
Thanks, AJ. Actually, we first met at one of the social computing seminars that they have here, so that's kind of another Microsoft connection. And hello to people who are watching online as well. So yeah, I've just transitioned from Glasgow to San Diego, and it's nice to be here because it's nice to be in a place that actually has weather. I've kind of missed that a little bit in Southern California. But actually, it turns out in one of those ways where we kind of spend time in other places, that this piece of work was done while I was visiting Microsoft Research in Cambridge. So the clock and the study was done in collaboration with the SDS group there. So I'm sure many of you know those guys, and you might well even see some of the technologies that I'm going to be talking about. And at the end, I'm also going to talk a little bit about a different system that we developed at Glasgow, which we did a short trial of, which I think is kind of quite an interesting kind of contrast case. Okay, right, let's get started. So the technology that I'm going to talk about today, Microsoft technology got some kind of nice publicity around it, perhaps in one way because of its resemblance to Harry Potter technology as well. It's a system called the whereabouts clock. But what I think is actually really distinctive about it is the way in which it's a technology not just to be part of family life, not just to be used in family homes, but a technology that actually assists families being families. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, but it's interesting, I think, to see with the trial of this technology how the mothers and the daughters particularly raved about it was a technology that made them feel more of a family. So not just in families, but actually helping people do the work of being a family. Well, what's the device? So this is a picture of the clock here, and it's in its most technical kind of formulation. It's a kind of a GSM tracking system. It runs on Microsoft smartphone handsets, and it basically uses GSM cell towers to track where family members are. It's a bit of a hack actually to get the cell tower information. It used to be in Windows Mobile, and I think that's actually been one of the nicest accidents that they ever made on Windows Mobile in the way that really supports a lot of interesting positioning technology. So this system tracked GSM cell towers and used that information to work out whether you were, if you were using the system, whether you were at home, work, or school. And those were zones that you yourself tagged. You actually took your phone out and you said, this is my home, or you said, this is my work, or this is my school. So you had the ability yourself to define what those places were. When the phone, when you moved from one zone to another, it would send a message back to this clock, and the clock would move your face around that clock face there. So kind of quite interesting technology, particularly because it only displays positions on one screen, on this clock that's in the family home. So that was done deliberately to deal with some of the privacy issues, of course. But kind of interesting from a lot of positioning technologies which are based along, doing a lot of things on the phone. The phone just passively tracks you. But you know what, why don't I give you just a little quick demo of that clock. So if I can find my mouse here. And I should be able to go in here, and if I can do, let me try that. Nope, sorry. Sorry, I had I'm just going to give you a demo of the clock there, but I can't actually find it, so. That's strange. Yeah, I guess I'm moving from one machine to another, so I'm kind of confused about why that wasn't there. But you can see some screenshots there of of the clock face there. So you have these faces, which are these bubbles, and these float around on the clock face. And as I say, when you move from one zone to another, the bubble moves from one zone to another, and the clock chimes. So basically you're in one of 4 positions. So you're in like home, work, school, or in the middle, which is in no location at all. So it can't find whatever zone you're in. No, and there's no, sorry, no, it's just an ordinal kind of location. So there's some extra features as well. There was some, like a sort of in-house trial that was done of the clock, and one of the things that came out of it was that people often aren't where they're expected to be. And what would happen then is that, there was this sort of confusion as to why is such a person not where they're meant to be. So a feature that was added to the clock was the ability to message the clock. So using the phone, you can send a text message that appears on that clock. What happens is the words kind of float around the person's picture. And then if you just touch it with your finger, it's one of the old touch displays before you couldn't use your finger. When you touch it with your finger, it pops up and you see the text message that's been sent to the clock. So that's actually one of the kind of things that came out of the trial quite a lot was people wanted to message from the clock. But actually that kind of really hits a real tension, I think, with the design of the clock, which is the way in which the design was really pared down. You can see that there's not much functionality there. Really even actually adding the messaging was kind of, had its own kind of controversies. It's a really, if you might call it a parsimonious design. There's like, the whole less is more thing. I actually think that a lot of the trade-offs that were made in this prototype were really the right ones. So I think that would have been a useful thing to do, to be able to hit the face and then send maybe a stock text message back. But then on the other hand, one could argue that how often do stock text messages get used on mobile phones? So again, it was paring down the functionality as much as possible. I mentioned as well, it was a suggested feature that people came up with. They said, yeah, they'd like to kind of message from the clock. But I guess the heart of good design is resisting the temptation to do what people ask for, isn't it? It's kind of, yeah, I know, it's kind of a difficult one. So.
What they ask for is good.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. Yeah, the balance. Well, yeah, but I guess when I talk a little bit about how the clock kind of got used, I think maybe the interest for us was really what design, like wins that we had from the design, maybe rather than the details of this particular instantiation. I mean, like another kind of point about it as well is that the location was only displayed on the clock itself, and that was a fixed display in the family home, rather than displaying it on the mobile phone. And again, that was another feature request that kind of came up, which was, wouldn't it be great if we could see the location of other family members on the phone rather than just being tracked with the phone. But then again, you begin to get problems with of course, privacy, which is a big issue around location tracking technology. Whereas having a clock in the home, you actually have to be in the home to be able to see the positioning. It's actually kind of quite a nice shortcut around a lot of privacy issues, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So we did a trial of the clock, and rather than go for a trial with lots of participants, we rather went for a longer trial with a smaller set of families. Tried to look at them in really kind of some depth there. So we tested the clock with 5 families. Each of them had the clock for at least a month, and 2 of the families who particularly liked the clock asked if they could have the clock for longer, and they ended up having it for 2 months. The limitation being that we actually only had 2 prototypes to deploy there. But while the families had the clock, we were interviewing the participants every week. We were taking the logs of them using the phones and the clock, and also the message logs, and then bringing them back into the interviews when we interviewed them every week. Now, so 5 families. Where were they based? Well, they were based in London and Cambridge. They were recruited through school connections that Microsoft Cambridge has. And rather than emphasize perhaps how they were representative or typical, I'd be kind of hesitant to do that with something as diverse as family life. I'd rather suggest that they were, if you will, idiosyncratic families. So they really kind of mapped out a space of lots of different family issues that came to deal with the interaction of the clock. So they dealt with a whole kind of range of issues that people have to deal with in their home life. Things like unemployment, or dispute over religion in the home, or people working at home, or situations, for example, when the father's at home, unemployed, and the mother's out working. And also, very importantly, and this is a point that came up time and time again, was people dealing with multi-home separated families, families where the parents perhaps have separated and the children go between different homes. They also had quite an idiosyncratic set of occupations there. So you can kind of get like a sort of flavour for the sort of people who we had using the clock. Okay, so I'm going to kind of talk about the different uses of the clock, and actually I think some surprising uses there. There's certainly ones that we didn't expect. And then I'm going to kind of try and kind of dig in a little bit more to some of the I think the kind of broader themes that we can draw out, particularly for how we might design positioning technologies. So, how did they use the clock then? Well, there's some very gross figures there. 72% of trial days were tracked. That was just that the phone was tracked at least once on that day. So there's kind of quite a high variation there. So you can see that there was some problem with having to carry an extra phone around. None of the families used Microsoft smartphones, so they had to carry two phones around. And for some people, this meant that they moved all their communication over to the Microsoft phone because they were getting free calls. But for others, they carried two calls around with them. And actually, interestingly, the message load was quite high. If you kind of average that out per household, it's about one message a day. So the messaging features of the clock were certainly getting used. And I'm going to talk about these kind of four themes here in terms of how it was used. So I don't know if any of you might be kind of familiar with some of the previous work that's been done on positioning. Very close by, of course, the Intel chaps in Seattle have been doing a lot of work on positioning over time. And a lot of that work emphasizes what you might call using positioning for coordination. That is, changing your plans based on what you find out from where people are, or, working at, where you'll meet with people or what have you. But, and the clock was used for these coordination uses, but perhaps not as heavyweight as that, perhaps slightly more lightweight. And if you forgive the sort of slight Britishism there, what we called these moments was put the kettle on moments. So a few times John has left a message, and about 6:15, I've seen his photo moved up to home, and I've thought, John is coming home, and I had a cup of tea ready for him before he's even walked in the house. So it's the way this, an affectionate gesture can be done by the information in the clock. But you can also see that that's kind of quite fail-safe. If the clock gets positioning wrong, as it sometimes did, you're going to be left with a kettle boiled in vain. Another participant talked about how he would time when he cooked dinner for his wife coming in the home. And these things, they might not seem as important, perhaps as more explicit coordination uses. They are part of the kind of affectionate gestures that can make family life work well. Messaging also was used for these kind of coordination features. So we had some messages like, shopping done, help please. M11 accident, taking back roads. Kind of the sort of informing you about, different things that are happening on your way home. The clock, by the way, could take messages from either your own cell phone or the Microsoft cell phone. But kind of to our surprise, the family members kept emphasizing to us that it wasn't these coordination kind of explicit uses where the real value of the clock came from. What was more valuable was not as it were telling family members what they didn't know, but telling them what they already knew. This kind of quote, I think, sums that up. So I just come in and yep, everything's in its right place, all's right with the world, just at a glance. It's just nice. It's not checking up on people. It's just a nice little reassurance. Everyone's where they should be and everything's right, or at least their phones are in the right places. When you can't take these things too far. You're not using it as a security device like that. So that's the kind of clock giving family members a reassurance that everything is going as usual, everything is in the right place at the right time. The routines are happening in family life like they should be. And funnily enough, the chimes that the clock gave turned out to be very important for this use. So one of the things that the clock did was if, when you moved from one zone to another, your face moved, the clock would do a chime. And this kind of sort of gentle chiming in the background, if you're working at home, gave you this kind of background information about everything else going as routine.
Was it a coded audio signal?
It's just a simple sample. Same sample gets played for each person.
Right, but I mean, was there a particular sample that meant moving from home to work?
No. And again, actually, that was one of the things that came up, was people wanted different chimes for different family members, so they could tell who was moving where. I guess you could do a kind of 4 by N thing, couldn't you, with sound samples? Maybe I'm not sure if that would work. So this kind of, as I say, this reassurance was an important part of it, part of the use of the clock. And Rachel, one of the mothers who had the clock, I think put this really very clearly to me. She asked me, well, she started by asking me if I had any kids, which kind of felt a bit nervous about. I thought I had a few years until I had to answer those kind of questions. And then she said, well, you know, Barry, I don't know if you don't have kids, you might not understand this, but... And then she actually goes on to explain what the value of the clock was for her.
When you can't visualize where your offspring are, you have this ridiculous sense of anxiety that's just bubbling very quietly. We didn't go and visit Kate at uni until late October, didn't we? And once I'd seen her flat, and I'd seen where her faculty was, and saw the kind of journeys she was making, and that she'd got great friends, and after that it was just like, and it really didn't register any anxiety about her on a day-to-day basis. And my ex-husband says that he finds it quite hard because he can't mentally think what the kids' schools are like, because he hasn't got in his car and driven here and found out. And if it was really bothering him, he would do. But there's sort of a basic instinct about wanting to visualise where they are. And actually, I think in some way the clock helps me think, yes, they've definitely got there, and they're definitely there now, and they're on their way home. It's an additional tool to that visualisation, really.
So I think that kind of sums up some of the values of the clock. You can hear in the background there Alex Taylor, who's doing the interview with me, humming away there as well and agreeing with those points. I'm kind of finessing a little bit on this this kind of reassurance. The visualization of the clock also helped to kind of give a sense of connectedness to the family members. So one of the features of the clock was that if, say, different areas had both been tagged as home, if you were in those home areas, you'd still be visualized in the same space. So this meant that, say, children who perhaps would spend alternate nights in different homes, they could tag both of those homes as home. And whatever home they were at, they would still be visualized as the same place on the clock. So that was kind of important for one father, because he talked about how he'd come home at night and he would see all the family members nestling at home at the top of the clock. So he sees everybody with this unitary sense of connectedness, even though actually two of his children didn't actually stay with him. So he kind of gave him this sense of, again, this sense of reassurance that his family had some sort of unity in the visualization in the clock. And this wasn't just a static visualization. This was one that was actually showing that everybody was safe and at home. So this is kind of sense of connectedness. Kind of, moving on from that, there's also the way in which the system allowed family members to author their location. So of course, I talked about there, about how people read location. So they're looking at the clock to find out, where their family are. But also, the clock supported you choosing what you chose different areas to be. So one of the families, I think, kind of household E, we called them, was kind of quite interesting in how they did that. They were almost maybe a bit of an extreme example of this. Even though the mother of the home there was this kind of self-professed technophobe, she was actually quite original in how she tagged different areas. So for work, she was actually unemployed. So what she tagged as work was the garden where she actually went to do gardening. She had a kind of allotment garden that she went to. And that was what she tagged as work. And for school, well, she went along a river and she walked the dog along this river. And she went and tagged every few meters, she kept tagging the phone as school. So even though this was an area that was actually like a walk along a river, this got repeatedly tagged as being school. You can see also things like, for example, the daughter there, she's tagging multiple places as home. There's the boyfriend's home and the family home. And also the school, the train station where she picks the boyfriend up after work. So she's kind of like allowing taking on the labels and realizing that, when she comes home from work and she's picking up her boyfriend, it'll go into school. Again, kind of flexibly using those labels to communicate.
I thought you said there were basing it on the cell phone base station, which wouldn't have the resolution to distinguish computer from watching TV.
I'm just going to mention that actually. So yeah, obviously for the father, he tagged work as using the computer at home and home as watching TV only a few meters away. And of course the positioning system had no hope whatsoever of being able to tell the difference between that. Every time he changed, he actually manually changed it on the phone and re-tagged that location, kind of appropriating it a little bit like kind of Twitter or one of these systems. You know, every time re-tagging it as work or home.
Who was watching?
Well, this is the thing, it's visible on the clock, and the clock's actually in the home as well. So I would argue actually that this isn't just about, you know, he isn't just kind of letting people know the information. He's actually doing a bit of work in composing what he thinks work is. He was unemployed as well. So for him, having something that he could say was work was kind of important for him. Doing a bit of kind of composing, if you will, of his position vis-a-vis his family. So some kind of interesting, I think, kind of uses of the authoring, if you will, that this just very simple mechanism lets you do. So an old theme that certainly for the SDS group in Cambridge has been how systems can be used for social touch. There's a home note system that they previously worked on that you might have seen, which was a whole messaging system. And again, we saw the messaging being used in the clock heavily for that. And these were often, you know, the messages that got sent to the clock were often kind of joke messages which continued on kind of running jokes in the family that, you know, things that wouldn't actually make much sense to us until we brought them up in interviews with the family and they explained whatever particular running joke was going on at that time, fitting into, if you will, the kind of emotional repartee of the home. You know, and so here's a kind of quite practical thing as a positioning technology, but again, you can see how it's getting used to play with the social organization of the home to kind of, you know, to fit with the sort of emotional joking that families do, that part of kind of the enjoyable aspects of family life. Okay, so I've talked there about, if you will, kind of fairly specific uses of the clock. Let me kind of pan out a little bit, and I want to go into a little bit more sort of detail about some of the themes that we might get from this trial. And the first one I think is kind of interesting is a kind of perennial topic for any sort of tracking system, which is privacy. It's obviously been, certainly in the academic research anyway, it's been one of the big issues. But strange enough, despite our repeated questioning, we were very sensitive about this issue, and we asked, in our interview schedules, we had quite a few questions about privacy. Despite our repeated questioning, none of the families reported worries about privacy. Indeed, our repeat questioning was actually met with puzzlement. As they explained to us, the clock actually showed a lot of information they already knew through wit of being a family. So I don't want to kind of downplay the tensions and pressures of family life, but I think those reactions reflect that family life is actually built upon shared awareness of what's going on. The sort of everyday coordination that you do as a family, eating together, driving children around, sharing costs and so on, would be impossible if you didn't know where everybody else was. So, you know, the knowledge and control of a family's comings and goings are, of course, being brokered, and there's issues to do with, you know, hiding information and such. But family life is also built upon actually knowing and communicating those matters. So in a sense, privacy is too sharp a point to examine these issues here, because it's as much about revelation, revealing, as it is about hiding information. I mean, even one of the teenagers who used the system, we asked him again, we thought, of course, you'll have privacy concerns about this. And he sort of explained it this way. So he said, you know, yeah, so a lot of my friends have said, so your parents are checking up on you, like? And I said, nah, this is not like that. It's not accurate enough. It doesn't tell you exactly where I am. I can go places and they won't know where I am. So you see, what you might see as a kind of shortcoming of the system, its kind of crudeness in terms of the locations it offered, actually turns out to be something that is a benefit here in terms of the privacy that it held. I mean, we even went so far as to kind of try and provoke concern by talking about, you know, the possibility of hackers stealing the phones and the like. But again, it was, you know, our participants explained to us, well, you know, if they steal the phones, what does it matter? Because they can't actually get any information out of it. All they can do is just use it to tag location, and the clock is safe in the home. Second kind of recurring issue has been, you know, that there's the sort of focus on designing location technologies to be, say, more accurate, to have better resolution or coverage or such. And these are obviously very valid technical goals of system design. But Actually, I think this study kind of brings out maybe a sort of different way of thinking about this, which might actually lead us to think about actually different technologies that we might build here, which is to say that accuracy, resolution, and coverage are not important for end users at the end of the day as technical features, but for what they actually mean in interaction, in the actual use of the system. So let me give you an example of that. So one of the mothers would cycle home to work, and she'd cycle home over a bridge. And she'd actually, an area that was further along from the bridge, she'd tagged as school, because that's where she went rowing. She would go there and she'd go rowing. And that was that area tagged. But as she went over the clock, the system would misrecognize her. It would think that she was further along the river where she did her rowing, and so she would ding into school. So while this could be a kind of technical example of inaccuracy, for the family, though, this wasn't inaccuracy, because they just got used to the routine, and they knew that when she moved into school, that meant she was on her way home. So they could kind of use the way the system worked and its routine way it used to kind of understand better the routines of their mother, and when importantly she was coming home. They kind of flexibly read the location, taking into account its kind of automatic nature. So this is kind of a kind of general point, which is rather than just thinking about location as a technical feature, think about what it actually means in family life. So you might actually, one of the things that's come up is, and I talked a little about there when I talked about how they tag different areas, that location has a moral sense in family life. So one observation that's been made is that often people read where people are to mean what they're actually doing. It's one of the reasons that why when we speak to people on the phone, often first things we ask is we say, where are you? As a proxy in some ways for what are you actually doing. But pushing this further, the location in this system really had this kind of moral sense, because if you were late, if family members were late or they made changes to their routine, they could be called to account by other family members. They could get into real trouble. So they would use messages to account for that. Or they might choose to, for example, change their positioning between work and home, depending whether they're out gardening or whether they're actually using the computer. So there's a sense in which location wasn't just sort of read as a proxy for location wasn't just read as a proxy for activity, but it was actually involved in the sort of judgments that people make as part of family life, the kind of moral sense. Taking that all together, I actually think that kind of suggests kind of quite different technical systems that you might build if you think about what location might mean in interaction. So, for example, one of the things that a lot of work has been put into is three-dimensional positioning inside buildings. But if you look at the importance of location awareness in this sort of interaction, you might find that it's what address people are at that's more important than necessarily their three-dimensional position in a building. And that could lead to quite different location technology. You might, for example, look at putting sensors on doors or the like. So kind of looking at location as what is important for in interaction actually ends up you kind of suggesting different kind of technical systems that you might build rather than just optimizing for accuracy, resolution, and coverage and the like. The last point, and kind of this is possibly one of the kind of hardest points to kind of get to kind of communicate, but this is the sense in which I think the clock was useful for families, not just as a kind of thing for finding out where people were or what was going on in the family, but for helping them actually produce a sense of what they were as a family. Let me kind of explain that in a little bit more detail. So there's this sociologist, Harvey Sachs, and he has this concept which he talks about, which he calls private calendars. Private calendars are this idea that as a group, as a family group perhaps, you have this sort of sense of what days are in your future calendar. You might have, say, birthdays or days when people are starting new jobs or days when holidays are. You have this shared private calendar together. And that private calendar isn't just something that you can use to kind of know what's happening in the future, but it's also part of being a social group that you share that calendar together. And the clock in a similar way supported, if you will, a private geography, a kind of sense of what places were in the particular city these people were living in, a sense of what those places were that was just known by that family. And it actually made visible on the clock face what that family geography was. If you think about it as a family, you have a kind of sense of where places are, favourite restaurants, places where events happened, workplaces, schools and the like. You have this kind of family geography. And the clock helped support that. And so as with the points about the private calendar, this wasn't just about helping you coordinate your family life, but making you actually be a family together, is that you have this shared sense of the city. And that the clock actually supported that technology. It was a technology to help families be families. This is particularly important for some of the mothers and the young daughters who were using the clock, because the clock actually, it wasn't just a sense of seeing what was happening in the family, but you could be seen by others to be watching the clock, and you could bring it up later in conversation with them. You could do some of the work of being a mother, which is being seen to take due care and attention to other family members. And the clock supported that in some way, in this kind of like seeing what other people are doing and being seen to monitor other people's activities. Helping, if you will, to kind of support families as a bit of a work in progress, helping to kind of help the family kind of work as a family. And I think this is particularly kind of interesting as you think about what technologies you might build here. So not technologies to support family coordination, but actually technologies to help families do the work of feeling like a family and being a family. That example of having the icons of everybody nestling up at home, bringing some kind of unity to a family that might be distributed in some way over different homes. Okay, so these are some of the kind of points here. I've mentioned some of them in passing there. We new ways of maybe thinking about designing location technology. A little bit there about the kind of aim of this kind of technology, which is that in the sense that the smart there isn't the smart of the device, but of the family themselves, of getting to understand the technology and using it. And I mentioned this point here about using the technology to support families being families. Now, I want to move on now and just talk a little bit about a quite different kind of system, actually. This one wasn't done in Microsoft Cambridge. It was done up in Glasgow just before I left. And this is a different location technology for a different social group. And you'll see that we designed it in some different ways, and it turns out to have some kind of different uses. And rather than being a family positioning system, this is a system that's designed for groups of friends. And it's called ConnectAll. And what ConnectAll does is it has a list of your friends. You put in or rather people who are running the system. And again, it uses the tagging facility for allowing you to tag different locations. But we reasoned that unlike families, groups of friends probably have a lot more diversity in where they go. So we actually allowed you just to label, you have a free label that you can put in for different locations for where you are. And then in the interface, it tracks where you are using the phone and then communicates that to everybody in your family group. So similar kind of technology, but kind of slightly different, slightly different instantiation. And I have to say, with apologies to Shahram Azadi, who did a lot of the great technical work, this has got a lot better positioning system behind it as well. One of the features of it is that it does let you switch between automatic and manual positioning, because we felt, because the information was being displayed on the phone, that there'd be issues again about privacy, about what happens if the phone got stolen. So or rather in terms of it communicating where you are to other people when you don't want that information to be communicated. So you can choose to whether to have yourself automatically tracked or manually tracked, where you just enter a location yourself that you want to see where you are, or just say you're not at any location at all.
Aside from people adding and removing that list, is it spatially stable?
It is, yeah. It doesn't. The names don't move around. Yep. The one other bit of information it communicates is your phone status. And if you change your status, I guess you guys will know on smartphones you can change your status from silent to whatever, and it does communicate that. So actually in the trial that we found that people started playing around with some of these kind of messages, so you got kind of not silent and these kind of sort of things getting put in here. So kind of, again, quite a lightweight coordination technology, and we tried to do some work with communicating when you were with other people. So if you were with somebody else, it used Bluetooth to find that you were near somebody else, and then it would color these circles the same color. Unfortunately, it didn't move you, so that was kind of one issue with the names. So a kind of different group from families. It's these groups of families. So how was that kind of how did that have a difference in how the system actually got used? Well, it seemed at the interviews that there was a lot more dynamic locations. Obviously, the technology itself supported all these different location tags. But in using the system, and we had a trial of I think it was 2 weeks of using this system. We need to actually do a longer trial. We plan to do a longer trial of this system, just as long as we can get hold of some smartphones to do that trial. But we did a trial of 2 weeks, and we're kind of sort of in the progress of kind of working up these results here. But even just from looking at the early results from here, we can see there's quite some interesting differences from how the clock was used. One of them was this, more dynamism in locations. If you're actually using this system and tagging different locations, as a group of friends, you end up kind of building this quite interesting map of different locations that you've tagged in the city using your phone. Again, this sort of shared private geography of where different places are and what you think are interesting places in the city. So the groups of friends were more sensitive to disclosure, and indeed would do a lot more work into being careful to author what actual locations they were actually at, so that they were meaningful in different ways to different people. I'll talk about that in a moment. And also, location and the information about where different people were, it became this kind of quite interesting part of the storytelling and repartee that takes place amongst groups of friends. And that was even more extreme perhaps than it was between the family groups. So let me give you an example by talking through 4 different location labels that got used on this system. So rather than just saying in lecture, one label that was entered was boring accounting lecture. So again, it's looking about not just sort of like telling you where you are, but telling about the story behind that, actually kind of having something that might contribute to the kind of ongoing conversations that groups of friends have together. Another participant entered horny as their label, and then ended up getting a phone call from another friend saying, I can't believe you just did that. You just put that in as your label. So this is the kind of example there of a label, subverting the position label even more than what went on with the whereabouts clock. But that, in turn, not being this kind of like dramatic, disastrous event, but something that sparked off conversation. They get the phone call back. Another participant was actually out visiting Amsterdam and then changed their label to on the job, which is a euphemism for having sex. So again, this is a kind of extreme example there of how they could use labels to kind of make jokes about what they're doing. Pretty gross one, it must be said, but that way there that only really could possibly be humorous if you knew that person was in Amsterdam. So again, there's a group of friends, they all knew this. They kind of knew where people were and when they were going away on holiday. So the kind of labels make sense as, again, part of this kind of friendship repartee. The last example is one participant who was meant to be going to a football match and changed the status to the stadium because it turned out he couldn't actually get tickets and go to the stadium. But by changing his status to the stadium, his friends thought he was at the match where his football team got annihilated. And so then they're all phoning him up and sending him text messages saying, oh, how was the match? And he kept the charade going because he just, he put it in the stadium. The system wouldn't know where he was. It's just a kind of text label. And he kept that kind of charade going until the next day when he kind of phoned everyone up and said, I used this system to lie to you. So again, this is way in which the dynamism and flexibility of this location labels really kind of supports humorous interactions, the kind of stuff that we like to do amongst groups of friends. Some other things I'm kind of interested in that come out from how this system get used. One of them is that, as with the family clock, it wasn't just seeing where people were, but also being seen to see where other people were, showing, as it were, due attention to what we should have seen about others' location. So in the interviews, people were talking about saying, well, I'd be in conversation about something, and we'd take for granted that we knew that such and such person had been somewhere, information we could only know because of what the phone was telling us. So in a sense, it kind of you take for granted that this is another contribution. The locations of everybody as they change over time are another contribution to what that group of friends know. So this kind of being able not only to see what other people, not only to see where other people are, but to take for granted that other people have seen where you are. Again, of course, where we're kind of interested in issues around sensitivity and privacy. Again, we've kind of pushed these issues in the interviews, and they surprisingly didn't come up. We thought that for a group of friends, much more than a family, they would have issues about privacy sensitivity, but this was not things that came up. And these were a group of friends who were using this technological system, as I say, for a couple of weeks. So, not just answering a kind of questionnaire, they're actually using the system and reporting on it. Of course, it could be that there's particular features of the group that chose to use this technology that perhaps they're more open to these sort of systems. Lastly, I think there's this kind of interesting difference here between families and friends in terms of being social groups, and quite different kind of technologies there. You might think of location technology as being a kind of all-size-fits-one approach, but that's kind of interesting that you might have one technology for families and a different technology that's appropriate for groups of friends. Okay, so I'm kind of like going to draw some of this together. And I guess the point I'd like to make kind of broadly about these systems is that location sharing technologies are getting easier and easier to implement. GPS chips are getting lower power and they're getting smaller, and I think it's probably going to be the next must-have feature on most cell phones. But of course, that technology has its particular problems, in particular sort of long startup time. So that's not to say that other technologies such as Wi-Fi positioning or cell tower positioning don't have their place. But what these all contribute to is the fact that these features are getting easier and easier to implement. And I think it's interesting to see that from these studies at least, there's considerable value for two quite different social groups in having these kind of technologies in use. So I thought I'd kind of make quite a bold prediction, which is, although these technologies seem quite strange now and quite unusual, I would suggest that in about 20 years' time, we're all going to be using these location tracking technologies. And that provokes a whole range of interesting other issues about the changes that could happen to how we organize our social lives. In the same way that text messaging and mobile email has done some changes to what we do on the move, these kind of positioning location technologies, I think, could have similar sort of interesting changes and implications. So thank you very much. So, and these are all my kind of very esteemed collaborators who did a lot of work on both these systems. Corey?
So I had a question about the privacy aspect, because again, everybody thinks that there's huge privacy concerns, but then when you talk to users, they don't seem to be as worried about it. Do you think it's more because of the granularity of the information you're giving, because it's fairly coarse-grained, or is it because it's a trusted group, or?
Yeah, I guess my kind of take on it would be that, because I think privacy in inverted commas is still a very important issue, and even if people tell you it's not, it's obvious that people do make decisions. The implication of the decision. But my point would be that maybe a lot of the way that privacy gets formulated as being somehow something that laws could be passed about is not really a right way of thinking about it, and that a far better way is thinking about the way in which in family situations or friendship situations you have this constant disclosure and constant kind of holding back of information. So with the second system there where you could author, an exact label for your location, you'd put a lot of work into designing that so it gave the right amount of information. You might even make it mean so that you write it so that it means one thing to one person and one thing to another. And so in a way that is kind of you managing your privacy, but not in the kind of more explicit way that we usually think about privacy. But I don't think I answered your question. But
I was just wondering whether you think the granularity, how much that is an impact. Like if you pinpoint it on a map versus the sort of more, instead of the groupings that people can define.
yeah, one of the questions we asked in the family trial was, what would you think about a Marauder's map implementation? I don't know if you know Harry Potter, but it's a kind of dot on the map. And at least in the interviews, people were more sensitive to that than they were to this kind of very coarse-grained location. So I think, yeah, definitely the coarse-grained had quite a lot to do with the acceptance of the system. Which is, again, is that point about location and interaction might be a different thing. What could be a disadvantage of the system? Oh, it uses cell towers, so it's actually got lousy accuracy. Can turn out to be this really useful aspect of the system. It might support plausible deniability as well. So I'll work back. So,
So I'm also thinking about the GPS versus location, that sort of thing. It sounded from, especially your second study, like people were using it more, at least the examples you gave, gave us in the repartee section as an arbitrary personal tagging system and couldn't have noticed or possibly couldn't have cared if there was actually a cell tower location system there. Could we have replaced your system metaphorically with, say, a dodgeball that remembered your last state and just said, Barry's in the stadium until he says he's not in the stadium?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because obviously one of the systems we were kind of wary of was Twitter, which pretty much does what you're describing there. And those examples maybe don't show, but there was a sense in which people would build up a set of tags over time, and then they would, because it was doing it automatically in the background, they wouldn't be maybe be changing their status like 10 times a day, but the system would be. So there was scenarios where, like with the family example, they'd get home and then they'd get a phone call when they got home. So I think the big distinction between that system and, say, Twitter, as well as it being a slightly nicer mobile client, is the fact that it does a lot of this work in the background for you. I've used Twitter, and I know some people love it and will change their status all the time, but I think in terms of long-term use of these systems, having some sort of automatic status change is a big win. So.
Okay, and then I guess the converse question is that, I like to think of the world, I end up thinking of the world a lot in terms of things like databases. There should be some way to utilize all the brain power that people are spending, and in some best of all possible worlds, the fact that you type stadium here would be an indicator to some database somewhere that there was a stadium in this place, and that we could reuse that so that the next person who came there would be a stadium. Clearly, there's some tension between, on the one hand, the repartee functions of the labels are anything, and on the other side, highly functional labels that describe locations.
I guess you guys have seen the Yahoo stuff, which I think goes some way into doing that. They have a system that uses locations and tags on Flickr photographs to build a kind of map. And I think the trouble with that is it's like a map for everybody, and I'm not sure, there's other ways you might go about doing that, like as you suggested there, data mining techniques. Whereas I think what's distinctive about these systems is they produce a kind of geography in common, if you will.
So for those of us who hate typing in T9, which I realize applies to no British people whatsoever.
No, we all hate it as well.
You can imagine that, okay, I'm at SeaTac Airport. The last 1,000 people who have passed through SeaTac Airport have also tagged at SeaTac Airport. Can we, it would be nice if there was some way to think about utilizing that knowledge.
Yeah, one of the when this came up in design discussions, we talked about like having some split between maybe kind of group. You could imagine having it kind of like my group, my city's location tags, the world's location tags. Because the trouble with like for example the Flickr photograph tags, the trouble with them is that they're actually, a lot of them, they're tourists tags. Which is, whereas locals, they'll often take pictures that are kind of bar, it's like bar A, wedding B, or, whatever event C, and it's not, it doesn't work the same way that tourist tags do. So yeah. So I think there's loads of interesting stuff there. So.
Did you ever show the clock to Ms. Rowling?
What was that, sorry?
Did you ever show the clock to Ms. Rowling?
So, yeah, I guess you guys probably know Abby Sellen, but, I think she kind of always felt that, the clock was, was an independent idea. And I think although there's a lot of the crossover with the clock in Harry Potter, I think it's actually the way that the design came together that's really important for it here. Not necessarily the idea behind it, but actually kind of fun enough in the interviews, at the beginning of the trial, people talked a lot about the clock in terms of Harry Potter, and that's why I kind of hinted at in the title about the kind of magic of the clock. But it was funny as the trial went on, people seemed to more and more talk about the clock in terms of their family. Kind of one reading I think I've got of that is that at the beginning the clock was this very, very kind of magical device, because it did magical things like saying you were somewhere where you weren't at the wrong time, or saying where you were with incredible accuracy that it could never actually have done. But then over time it just got routinized, and in some ways this became something that you talked about something you knew very familiar, which was your family. So yeah, so I think it's a kind of really interesting kind of reference point for this. This was.
Did you ever show it to Ms. Rowling?
I don't think it has been shown to her, no. So I don't think she got the patent on it though. Anyway, that's one thing. So
So I really want one of these. You said you only had 2 prototypes. Can you say more about the technology, or is it documented in paper somewhere?
Yeah, it should be. There's an Ubicon paper that covers a lot of this stuff, and I guess you can speak to Sharam. Sharam's, got the, he can send you the code or whatever. Sharam Azadi, who's he's in the SDS group in Cambridge, so he can actually just send you the code and you could run it here. You build your own one; it would be pretty easy to build. It's like everything in smartphones these days. It's a .NET app running on cell phones, on Microsoft smartphones. Yeah, what else to say? The location technology, I think, I'd made this joke about the second system having a different location technology. We kind of took a little bit more of the sort of state-of-the-art location technology. The whereabouts clock just used the set of cell towers in view, which turns out to be really lousy because pretty much all cell phones are very sticky about changing that set, so you just get loads of lousy effects. So the system that's discussed in the paper, which goes with the second system, used a lot more use of signal strength to try and kind of model dynamism over time. But more of that's in the paper, and I'd be happy to send that to you.
So I have a question. Just your intuition is not necessarily based on data, but the question is sort of about the cultural specificity of what you've seen, and also kind of the temporal specificity. And you're now in a good position to move to San Diego, where, as I recall, Bill Griswold had at one point, I don't know how often they did this, but they had scores or maybe hundreds of students walking around with video cameras and stitching together a kind of a real-time video image of the UCSD campus that people could navigate around, and which would, of course, raise a lot of these sorts of issues about sensitivity and privacy and whatnot. And in addition, in England, you've got, each time I go back there, there are more cameras around recording everything that everybody's doing. And as soon as there's any kind of a crime incident, we're all quite well aware of the fact that they're piecing together an amazing amount of location, specific information. And so I guess, as we become more aware of that, our sensitivity, if everybody in the world except for our family knows where we are, then maybe we'll be a little less concerned about our family or our friends knowing. So I'm just, so how do you see, since you've been working in this area for a while, how do you see all this evolving in different locations over time?
Yeah, no, that's a kind of good question. I remember when I worked at HP and we'd come and present studies in the States, and unfortunately people really didn't believe the work unless it was done in the States. And so there's a kind of broad point, which actually I don't think that people are as different as made out a lot of the time. And I'm a bit of a materialist, as it were, when it comes to culture. I think what you find is that things are quite different in different countries, so people behave differently. So pricing structures are very different for cell phones in the US. And it was a lot later that pay-as-you-go, prepaid became popular. And so suddenly it's like this, I remember people used to tell me, yeah, Americans won't use cell phones, they won't use text messaging. Well, actually a lot of it is to do with the pricing structures, and I think you've seen a lot more cell phone use in recent years. And also, it turns out it's mobile email it just happens to be the most sensible technology, I think, rather than text messaging. But, so yeah, I think that sort of like maybe stepping outside the data a little bit, I wouldn't want to just say this country does this and this country does that, but like you say, there's different characteristics that happen in different places. So systems where people are doing a lot of driving, there was quite a few families used driving, and that was something that the system became quite important for, the family clock system, because you're kind of variable about when you're going to actually get home. And that, I think, applies equally in the United States as it does in Britain. Whether it works amongst people in Tokyo who maybe are doing a lot less driving, again, it's the the material aspects of those places. I think they're often important.
Seems like you could now mass produce these things, at least from the software side. Like Microsoft now has a hackable picture frame. If you give up touch, you can still make it.
Like as I was demoing at TechFest this year, and there's one of the groups, I don't know, the group that does the picture frame that I really love, and I was really excited about that because I wanted to code for it, and I thought this would be great on it. But I must admit, now I've moved outside Microsoft, I haven't seen it on the marketplace. Is it coming out, or is it? Yeah.
It's Samsung.
Yeah, but is it
Came out this fall.
actually purchasable in the United States?
Yes.
Great. Oh well, I'm going to buy one. I mean, I've got this other project I'm doing just now, which is, have you seen these Chumby devices? Yeah. So I've got like 10 Chumbies, and I'm getting students to do stuff with network Chumbies. So I think this is this really interesting kind of point now where a lot of this stuff can be really easily commercialized, and which raises a really tricky problem, which is what's the job of research labs to do this kind of stuff. But maybe that's a kind of discussion to have over dinner or whatever. So.
I have one more question, but I can ask it. So in the first study, it was very much like it's only on the clock, it's only in the house. On the second study, it looked like it's on the cell phone, right? I'm carrying around everyone's location rather than, you could imagine having your friend's clock at home or something. Can you sort of compare and contrast why you decided then to move it to the cell phone with the friends and sort of the implications?
So, to be honest, it came up a lot in the trials of the family system, the whereabouts clock, that people wanted it on their phone, and that was kind of resisted for, I think, lots of really good reasons. Because just with the second system, when we were building it, we didn't have a fixed display, so we ended up just building it almost accidentally. Often these design processes are like that. We built it on the phone. I think the difference with the Friends technologies, it was perhaps a lot more of a personal system for personal communications, less than this sort of explicitly family-based because of the fixed display. It'd be great to do something where you kind of mix them up, I think.
So do you think, my intuition would be that the friends then checked it a lot more than the family members because it was with them, accessible. Did you see that in the data, or is there any way to know amount of access?
I mean, I guess they have the potential to doing that, but the one thing with the clock did that you really wouldn't want your phone to do was that it chimed. And the chimes, again, came up as quite an important use of the clock. So whether you would count that as really using it or not, I don't know. I guess it is. But
Let's thank
great.
Barry.
Thank you.